So, welcome to Stalloris RPKI Downgrade attack. I'm Philipp Jeitner, and basically this is a paper, and we also have co-authors, Tomas, Donika, Haya, and Michael, who aren't here, and so I'm the only presenter, but they should be mentioned because I didn't do this alone. Right. So I want to shortly present our team. As said, we are a team of 5 people. I personally am Philipp Jeitner, as said, network security researcher. I just finished my PhD and yeah, I'm working on it. I also did my PhD at the Athena National Research Center, which cooperates with the Fraunhofer SIT Institute. And we are the cybersecurity and analytics and defenses department. We mostly do network security, and we focus on routing and DNS security. And so this talk is about routing security, obviously. And so let's start with it. First, we want to look at the outline. So what I want to present, we will look at BGP and BGP security. Then I will present you the resource public key infrastructure, short RPKI, because I think not everyone knows how it works and what it is. And then I want to present you our downgrade attack against it. Obviously, that's the title. And finally, we'll look at the feasibility of this attack and also some mitigations. What can you do against it, right? So first, let's look at BGP. BGP is the Border Gateway Protocol, and it basically forms the routing system of the internet. And very basically, you have networks which are called autonomous systems because our BGP looks at them from nodes, and so everything which happens inside the network, BGP doesn't care for. But those networks announce the IP prefixes they contain their own to their neighbors, and then the neighbors essentially forward these announcements to other networks. And finally, everyone should know how to send traffic. So essentially, like in the example, you have some networks. One network sends an announcement to another network, and that network forwards it and puts itself into the path. So everyone knows if I send traffic to that network, the network will send it to somewhere else, and then it should reach its target at some point. Right. So the problem with BGP essentially is it's an old internet system. As any old internet system, it doesn't really contain any security features because back then you didn't really need security. But essentially from like just the BGP perspective, what you can do is you can announce a prefix you do not own, basically get into a man-in-the-middle position and profit from that. The most known hijack was probably the My Other Wallet hijack, where there were attackers which hijacked the Amazon Route 53 service, which hosted the DNS service for the myotherwallet.com domain. And what the attackers did, they hijacked the domain, put the phishing site on this page, and basically got account access to all those cryptocurrency wallets and stole a lot of cryptocurrency. To fix that, the BGP security problem, the IETF introduced RPKI, which is the Resource Public Key Infrastructure. As the name suggests, it's a public key infrastructure for internet resources. And it's a systematic approach to BGP security where, a bit like TLS, you have certificates, and those certificates map address blocks to ASNs, autonomous system numbers. And those certificates are called root origin authorizations, and an ROA essentially contains the data displayed on the right. It's not JSON, it's actually an X509 certificate, but it contains essentially the data on the right, so you have an AS, you have a prefix, and essentially the certificate says that only this AS is allowed to announce this prefix. And the root of trust for this public key infrastructure are the RARs, the Resource Regional Internet Registries. And basically that makes sense because the RARs allocate address blocks. So basically if the RAR says you own an address block, then you own an address block. And if you think about it from a TLS perspective, because you are not that into routing or into BGP, you could think of it like getting your TLS certificate from the registry. So instead of going to a CA and asking them, okay, I want a certificate, it's like when you register the domain, you just get the certificate with it. That's kind of how it works. Right. And so now we assume that everyone has ROAs for their networks and their prefixes, which obviously it's not the case because it's a new system and only a third of the internet actually uses it, but we assume everyone has it, and right? Then we have certificates, but certificates are only worth anything if you actually validate them, right? And if you want to think about how to validate a certificate, there's like a naive way or an obvious way, which would mean that basically you put the certificate right to the information which is authorized by the certificate. That's like TLS does it. However, in BGP, that's a bit complicated because you can't really do it. It would mean that all the routers would need to verify all the certificates, which typically they don't have the processing resources for. And also it would basically blow up the size of BGP announcements, because currently an announcement is pretty small, but if you put like 1,500 bytes of certificate next to it, it gets a lot larger, and so it really inflates the traffic. So what the IETF standardized instead is the RPKI system, which is a third-party system to BGP, and it basically works with two basic components. There are repositories, which are called publication points, and you can think of them as essentially like an FTP server full of certificates. And then there are relaying parties, and those relaying parties are basically download all the certificates from the publication points, and then they validate all the certificates and generate a list of valid arrays, and then they just generate a list and push that list to the routers, and the routers doesn't have to do any cryptography. They just take the list and have a filter list, essentially. So that's RPKI, and it actually works. So this year there actually was a hijack by Russian Telecom, where they seemingly hijacked the Twitter prefix, probably because of censorship. And this hijack was actually prevented by RPKI RO validation, which means that the hijack basically didn't really affect other networks, except Russian Telecom, obviously. Right. So, assuming RPKI works, now we as an attacker or like a security researcher, we want to attack it, right? And if you think about how to attack RPKI, you essentially have different options. The most obvious one is to attack the integrity of the system. So the most obvious attack would be to create a malicious RA. For that you have to break the crypto, and breaking crypto is hard, so we don't want to do that. The second way would be to try to fool a CA. That's kind of how you attack TLS. You can try to fool the CA into giving you a certificate by, for example, attacking domain validation. That's a problem because in RPKI, the CA is the RER, and the RER has first-hand knowledge about who owns a network block, not like in TLS where the CA doesn't really know if you own a domain. They can just see if you have control over it. In RPKI, the certificate is generated by the person who basically gives you the resource. So it's hard to fool them because they have first-hand knowledge. And finally, obviously, because RPKI is a third-hand system, we can attack its availability. And so essentially the idea is that you have BGP, which the routers talk to each other, and you have RPKI. And if you attack RPKI and it stops working, then you still have the BGP routers, and the BGP routers still have to do decisions, but they don't have security information to base it on. And so that's how this attack starts. And some basic, also to start with, basically you have to know that RPKI is built for in-place deployment, as any internet system. So you have to handle cases where basically the AS, which you get an announcement for, it doesn't use RPKI yet. It's like this for like 60% of the internet, so this is very important. In practice, what happens is that essentially, if there are no arrays, you assume that the network hasn't deployed RPKI yet, and so essentially there is no validation happening, which means you accept any BGP announcement, at least from the RPKI side of things. There might be other BGP filters, but we don't consider that. Right. And so now the problem is that relaying parties cannot really differentiate between erroneous failures by downloading all these certificates and attacks which attack the connection, and so that's the reason why you can't download the certificate. And what happens if they can't download the certificates is essentially they will use old data unless it's valid, and after it expires, it's assumed that there are no arrays more and disable RPKI protection. And so this forms our attack plan. So what we want to do is we want to break communication between the relaying party and the publication point. Then the relaying party can't fetch information. It basically turns off RPKI, and then we can start our BGP hijack. Right. So that's the basic plan. Now, to make it work, we have to figure out some details. And the first detail is how does relaying parties work and what happens if they can't update things. So the first thing to know is that, as said, RPKI or our relaying parties cache all data until it expires. However, RAs are certificates and they expire pretty slowly. We measured that. We basically fetched all the RAs, and we found that most of them have a validity of 1 year, so we can't really block communication for 1 year. That's not a practical attack. However, there's something called a manifest file, and manifest files you can essentially think of as a signed index of valid RAs. So basically, manifest files are designed to prevent replay attacks. So assume you have an RA which is valid for 1 year, but now you sell the prefix to someone else. Then the RA is still valid. You could revoke it, but there's not really a good system for revocation either. So what happens is that essentially you remove it from the manifest, and by that it essentially becomes invalid because it's not referenced anymore. And this prevents a replay attack because then now you can't really use the RA anymore. That's a valid mechanism. However, it means that because these manifest files have a short expiry time, we can essentially use them to basically expire an RA, because if the manifest file which references the RA times out, the referenced RA will also time out. And manifest files have a short expiry time, typically 1 day. And so you only have to make the blocking communication attack 1 day. And effectively, actually, because of how those manifest files are generated, you only have to do it for 6 hours, because so the publication point software, which everyone uses, it's called Grill. And what the software does is essentially it only regenerates a manifest file if it has 6 hours or less of validity left. And so what you can do as an attacker, you can wait for this 6 hours to start essentially and start your attack just right before. So you only have to do it for 6 hours instead of 1 day. Right. So we now know that we essentially have to break communication for 6 hours between a relaying party and the publication point. And now we have to figure out how we do it, right? You obviously could do a denial of service attack, but denial of service is pretty noisy, and there's a chance that it would get noticed during these 6 hours. And if they block your denial of service attack, then essentially you don't achieve anything, because you have to actually block it for straight 6 hours. Otherwise, the relaying party updates and nothing is gained. So what we do instead is a low rate attack. Especially we exploit rate limiting on the publication point or the name server which serves the domain. And so rate limiting is a mechanism which is designed to prevent denial of service. The basic idea is you have a rate limit which is, for example, 1,000 packets per second per IP address or per IP address subnet. And anything which is above that number will just get thrown into the trash bin essentially. So if there's a rate limit of 1,000 packets and you get 2,000 requests, for example, you just serve the first 1,000 and then you wait until the bucket is refreshed and then you do the same again. And what you can do as an attacker, you can essentially exploit this mechanism to block communication from a known source, because what you can do is you send basically spoofed requests, either spoofed DNS requests, that's easy because it's UDP, or you can also spoof TCP/SYN packets. Some firewalls do also rate limiting for TCP/SYN packets. And what this will do is it essentially blocks the victim, because you as an attacker reach the rate limit and then the victim won't get an answer anymore. And after 6 hours, the idea is that because the victim can't communicate with the publication point, the manifest times out. So how often is rate limiting used in RPKI, right? Because if you want to exploit it, it has to be present. And we measured this essentially in the real publication points. Currently, there aren't that many. There are like the big publication points, which are operated by all the RRs. And you can also own your or operate your own publication point. We will get to that later. But anyway, we basically measured if they do TNS request rate limiting, or if they do TCP SYN request rate limiting. And our results are that roughly half of the publication points do that with a limit lower than 10,000 packets per second. We didn't test it higher because we didn't really affect the service. And they host roughly 60% of the RPKI protected IPv4 space. So basically the publication points which do rate very low. We define under 60 packets per second, not because 60 packets is an important number, because that's the biggest number we would consider low. So I think the next biggest one would be like 800, which we measured. And so now to basically think about feasibility, we would say, okay, so 60% of the RPKI protected IPv4 space does rate limiting, or the publication points do rate limiting, so it is vulnerable to the attack, in a sense. This is kind of true. However, you have to think about an example. So consider an example where you have a rate limit of 1,000 packets per second, and you have an attacker which sends spoof packets with a rate of 10,000 packets per second. And statistically, that means that there's a connection success for the valid user, which is roughly 10%, because essentially at the publication point, you will have 10,000 queries in a second, and you will also have one query coming from the legitimate user, and you would have 1,000 queries out of them which will get served. And because we don't know when the bucket is refilled, which controls when you answer the query or when you don't, you can essentially statistically say, okay, the success chance for a connection is roughly 10%, and then the inverse of that, which is the attack success chance, is essentially 90%, which is a good success chance, right? The problem is that relaying parties will retry. So they don't only do one query, they do like, if it doesn't work, they will do another query and another query and another query, and at some point it will time out. So if you really want to think if it's feasible, we have to think about all these retries, and we have to think about the 6-hour period and essentially measure how many retries will be done during 6 hours. And so this is what we done using a simulation. So basically we looked at different implementations of relaying parties. We looked at different operating system and resolver implementations. So essentially like DNS resolvers do different numbers of retries if they don't get an answer. For example, Unbound does maybe only one, but Bind does maybe more, etc. And you also have to consider the real-world rate limits which are in place. And so what our simulation essentially shows is that this attack is very feasible for low rate limits, like under 60 packets per second. And in this case, the attackers need to like send a rate of spoof packets like in the range of 1,000 packets per second. And then it basically leads to the situation where the relaying party won't get an answer during 6 hours, and so the manifest file will time out. However, if you have a higher rate limit, say 1,000 packets per second, the attack gets a lot more challenging, because basically it's the number or the rate of packets the attacker needs to send like gets into the range of 10,000 packets, and then you get into the range of a real denier of service attack. It's not a low rate attack anymore, so you could argue that it's probably getting noticed, and also maybe the attacker isn't actually be able to send that many packets because internet connection, whatever, connection to the target system, etc. So the attack works, but it only works in some cases. So obviously we want to try harder, right? And so additionally to the low-rated attack, what we can exploit is that RPKI allows delegation. As I previously said, you can run your own publication point. This is because it's like a federative system, right? They don't want to, basically, if you don't use delegation, then the publication point is run by the RAR. So you enter your information into the RAR portal, and you have to say, okay, I own this prefixes, which is certified by the RAR. And then the RAR generates a CA for you and puts all the certificates onto the RAR's publication point. Some networks don't want to use that. They want to control their own infrastructure, which makes sense. But what this means is that essentially, because any internet network can own their own publication point, attackers can also run their own publication point. They just have to purchase an IP prefix. And then what this means is that the relaying parties have to contact the attacker, publication point, to fetch the information about the attacker network. And so what this basically provides us as an attacker is a direct connection to the relaying party which we want to attack, which is an upgrade to the previous situation where we just were an off-path advisory, but we don't really have any connection. We can't connect to the relaying party. We can connect to the publication point, but it doesn't really allow us to do anything. So the question is, can we exploit this to break the relaying party? And obviously, because I asked this question, the answer is yes. And so this is what we call the Stalloris attack. The name comes from slow Loris, which is an attack against HTTP where you send requests really slowly. And in the Stalloris attack, basically what you do is that the attacker becomes a malicious publication point by owning a prefix, going to the IR portal and entering an URL there. And then if a relaying party wants to fetch the RAs for the attacker's network, he will connect to the publication point, and the publication point will basically send the response as slow as possible, but as fast as possible, so the relaying party doesn't time out, right? There are some limits, but basically, like you have to send traffic like it's faster than 10 kilobytes per second or whatever, and you can then also inflate the file size, so the connection goes on and on and on and on, and you're basically downloading random data. And the idea is basically that this hinders the relaying party from doing many retries. So because it's still updating our malicious data, which is just useless, it can't update the data it actually wants to have, which is about the other networks we want to do our BGP hijack against. And what this helps us with, or what this basically gains us as an attacker, is that it reduces the number of retries the relaying party can do against the publication point, which we do the low-rate attack against. And our simulation shows that essentially this helps with the attack because it reduces the amount of spoofed packets you need to send in the previous attack a lot, so it becomes feasible again. Right. So basically, to wrap it up, to provide like a summary, we showed that the design of RPKI as a third-party system allows attacks on its availability. Just because it's a third-party system, you can basically attack it independently of BGP, and that presents a problem because it basically you have a desynchronization. I showed you that the rate limiting mechanism can be exploited to block legitimate requests from off-path. You have to know the IP address of the relaying party, and we haven't talked about that, but it's possible because the same reason, because of the Stalloris attack, you can run a publication point yourself, and that means you see all the relaying parties in the world, and you can also reference them to the networks which they protect by guessing, but also by running an algorithm. Like you can essentially present one RA to one network, one RA to another network, and see which networks are affected by your different RAs. We have also shown that the short manifest validity makes the attack feasible, because without the manifest files, you would have to block communication for 1 year, which just isn't practical, right? And finally, if the rate limit is too high, you can also become a publication point yourself, and you can prevent the relaying party under attack. You can also do it selectively, so it affects less relaying parties from doing its work. So it's essentially busy with your malicious data and can't update that often. And so coming from that summary, we also have some recommendations, obviously, what you can do against the attack, and with basically 2 groups. So if you operate a publication point, you first should avoid really low rate limits. So for example, if you have a rate limit of the mentioned 60 packets per second per IP, it's probably enough for real operation, but from an attacker point of view, it's very easy to spoof. And nobody notices like 60 packets per second is nothing. I mean, if you have like a firewall or an IDS, it might show up there, but it's not like, it doesn't affect anything. Right. So going from 60 packets per second maybe to 1,000 packets per second is probably enough to defend against denial of service, but it basically makes the attack, which I presented, a lot harder. Then, if we consider manifest files, we suggest that you should increase the validity of a manifest file, maybe go from like a day to a week. And also what should happen is to randomize when the manifest is regenerated. So the attacker doesn't know that 6 hours before it times out, I need to start the attack. You should randomize it so the attacker has to basically do it for the whole period of 1 week and he doesn't know when it happens. And finally, we suggest that at least some publication points should take a more robust deployment policy. Basically, like some publication points, everything is in one network, and also the name servers are on the same network. And so basically cutting off this network from the internet also cuts off RPKI. And if you're operating a relaying party, we suggest that first you can monitor connection failures because they can indicate an attack. However, there are also a lot of random connection failures because someone didn't restart their publication point or some reason, so that there are a lot of errors. I mean, it's a new system, so people aren't that used to it maybe. But anyway, a connection failure can indicate such an attack. And what the implementers of relaying parties can do, and they also already did that in some ways, is that they should consider limiting the processing time which they spend on one publication point or like on the malicious attacker repository. So an attacker repository can just basically use up all the resources of the relaying party and make it not do its work for the other repositories. Right. That's the presentation. Now I would take questions, and otherwise, thank you.